Hey everybody, good to see you again. This is our wrap-up lecture on cognitive behavior theory. We're going to review here in just a second the third and fourth core ideas of this theory. And this is just kind of a follow-up to the video, hopefully, that you've already looked at, which kind of gave you a little bit of introduction into this very popular counseling approach, as well as the first two core ideas. And this video also is kind of our farewell wrap-up video lecture, because once you're done, we're done with this section of the class, you're done with the section of the class. So again, just a reminder to go in, make sure you've looked at the calendar, that you have found the case study, that you have found the handouts that I've put up for you, put up a bunch of stuff on CBT. There's lots of good stuff for us to share and talk about with cognitive behavior theory. So make sure you're looking at all that in the module and doing your case study, finishing exam number 3, and then you're good to go for our semester. So this is our farewell little lecture here as well too. So it's a little bit of a review. We talked last video about how cognitive behavior theory is a very popular, well-known, widely used helping approach for lots of different reasons. And there's all kinds of ways in which it can be used, and it is used. And what we're doing in this class is just talking a little bit about just some of the basics, kind of the basic, kind of fundamental core ideas. CBT used to be called Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, REBT, and occasionally if you do research or reading, then you sometimes see it still referred to as REBT. Developed by Albert Ellis, who was a behaviorist, he was a believer in behaviorism, and he was very fascinated in the cognitive part of us, the way in which our brain thinks and perceives. And so the theory is now called cognitive behavior theory. First two key ideas we talked about last lecture was number 1, this theory says that we are always talking to ourselves. It puts an emphasis on the belief system, thinking, perception, cognitive part of our mind. That internal part that no one can see, but we can identify and can see and can hear. So we talked about how there are lots of different names that we sometimes use for cognitive behavior. We use the word cognitive or cognition. The word beliefs and the word thinking or thoughts are two very, very common names. Also too, whenever we use the word mindset or belief system or perception or attitude, we're talking about that part of us, that internal part of us, where that we are always perceiving and talking to ourselves. So this theory says that we have an important part of us inside of us, that thinking process part of us that we're always engaged in. We're always talking to ourselves. And so this theory promotes the importance of that. So you can't really understand CBT unless you first kind of start with the idea of cognitive or cognition or thinking or thoughts or beliefs. That's key idea number 1. Key idea number 2 was the A, the B, and the C. So Ellis had a very, very straightforward, but also too, it's a very important way of looking at how we are wired. And he used this ABC acronym. Activating event is the A, B is beliefs, and C is consequences, emotional and behavioral consequences. So Ellis kind of proposes, and this theory kind of proposes, that when something happens around us, an activating event, we talk to ourselves about what's happening around us. That talking to ourselves is the B, beliefs. So A is the activating event, B is beliefs, talking to ourselves, or thinking to ourselves about what's happening around us. And that how we talk to ourselves, that's B, beliefs, influences other parts of us, our emotions and our behavior, emotional and behavioral consequences. And so you've heard the phrase, behavior has consequences. Well, Ellis would say thinking has consequences. How we talk to ourselves, our belief, our perception, influences other parts of us, our emotions and our behavior. So emotional and behavioral consequences. So that real simple idea of something happening around us, the A, activating event, and then B, the belief, us always talking to ourselves about what's happening around us, and how that talking to ourselves then influences our emotions and our behavior, emotional and behavioral consequences. Also too, remember we talked about with that core idea number 1, that oftentimes, although we're always talking to ourselves, we don't always hear it because that talking to ourselves, our thinking or our beliefs is often silent and automatic. Those are just real core, real simple ideas. Those first two core ideas are just basically just kind of basic, psychology 101, how this theory sort of looks at how you and I are naturally wired. Third, fourth core idea. Let's talk about those. The third one is this. All of these helping approaches that we're talking about in these classes really are built around the idea of people having problems. And I know that sounds kind of negative, but that's kind of what counseling and helping people in social services is really all about. We help people around struggles or problems. So there's really no counseling theory that doesn't focus at some level around helping people and their problems. Well, CBT has an interesting idea around problems. Bottom line is this is the third core idea, is that you and I, according to this theory, as people have an unhealthy tendency. It's easy for us to fall into a trap of negative self-talk or irrational beliefs or unhealthy thinking, whatever words you want to use. Now, you may be a person, and maybe you know someone who tends to be an optimist, who tends to be more of a glass half full rather than half empty kind of person. So there are a lot of people in our world today that tend to be more positive and upbeat and optimistic. Honestly, those people probably are few and far between, unfortunately. This theory kind of promotes that idea that for whatever reason, it's easier for us to be negative thinkers than positive thinkers. It's just easier for us to do that. And oftentimes we fall into a trap where we believe we have mindsets or beliefs that are just not healthy. They're not accurate. They're not good for us. And that's what gets us in trouble. What gets us in trouble is that negative self-talk. So the phrase negative self-talk is a phrase that Ellis kind of coined and belonged to him. I remember the first time I think I was introduced many years ago as a student to cognitive behavior theory. I remember one of the first terms I kind of grabbed onto was that term, negative self-talk. And I began to sort of look in my own life and realize, maybe not all the time, but a lot of the time, I'm having this conversation in my head, or I'm having these reactions cognitively or mentally or whatever, that really are kind of negative. And that's probably true for many of us. And so this idea of our unhealthy tendency, you can't really understand CBT unless you kind of understand this idea that we as humans have this unhealthy tendency that's just easy for us to fall into. It's a trap, negative self-talk. Now I want to give you, I've given you in the PowerPoint presentation, and again I want to refer you back to the PowerPoint. Make sure you're looking at the PowerPoint with the audio lecture that I posted for you in the module. I want to mention two ideas around this third core idea. Third idea is this unhealthy tendency of negative self-talk. First of all, I want to talk to you a little bit about where does that come from? And then I want to talk to you about some examples. So number one, where does our negative self-talk, where does our tendency to talk negatively or believe negatively or unhealthily in our lives, where does that come from? Well, in some ways it comes just from our mind. It's just kind of how we're wired. But more specifically, here are some examples of things that we know just based on our research and using this theory and others like it for many, many years. Number one, sometimes our tendency to be negative thinkers is really just sort of a function of our unique personality. Each and every single one of us is a unique individual, and we have characteristics and traits and skills and qualities and abilities and that really kind of make us unique. Some of us are more outgoing. Some of us are more withdrawn. Some of us are more positive. Some of us are more, maybe negative. Some of us are more analytical. Some of us are intuitive. Some of us are sociable. Some of us like to be by ourselves. So all of us have this unique personality. And I'm kind of a believer that your personality and my personality has both potentially positive, healthy aspects, but also two potentially negative aspects that we have to be careful about. And so I think that a lot of us sometimes, just the way we're wired as individuals can sometimes lead us to be more negative thinkers. Some of us are just more perfectionistic. Some of us are just more concrete in how we look at the world. And it's just a function of kind of who we are. And we just have to be kind of careful. One of the things that, that I think is important for all of us is to be aware of our own unique individual personality. and to be aware of how that makes us unique in positive ways, but also too, how that can also create problems for us. You probably have heard the phrase, sometimes my strength is my greatest weakness. I think about that phrase anytime I think about personality. I know for me, the things that I'm really, really good at and strong at that are easy for me at the same time can create problems for me if I'm not careful, if I don't manage them and live in balance and those kinds of things. So sometimes our unique personality influences our negative self-talk. Also, too, we know that experiences, life experiences that we've had as children in our families growing up, or maybe even as young adults, or just at some time in the past, sometimes we may have like negative experiences or traumatic experiences, and we're always learning from our experiences. It's just a matter of what do we learn. So if I go through some situations in my life where people hurt me, maybe not physically, but maybe emotionally, maybe through relationships, or I'm treated poorly, or I'm taken advantage of, or whatever it may be. If I live through a lot of those experiences, well, then it wouldn't be uncommon for me in my mind to begin to think that, hey, no one loves me. No one cares about me. The only thing people are interested in me is when I can do something for them or something like that. If I, as a child, was physically abused, maybe I was abandoned by my family, maybe I was told, maybe I received some messages. Unfortunately, I've had lots of clients I've worked with through the years who've told me stories about how, when they were growing up, they were just told straight out, hey, you're not very smart. You're not as pretty as your sister. We didn't want you to be born. You're not really, you mess everything up. People have heard, something, and maybe some of you in the room, unfortunately, people may have told you some of that growing up. And if we're not careful, we internalize those messages. There's an old saying that says, you tell someone something long enough, they'll start believing it eventually. All you gotta do is keep telling them. And eventually, over time, if we've been told something over and over again, whether it is directly or indirectly, spoken or unspoken, we may begin to internalize some negative messages about ourselves as far as us not measuring up, or as far as us being insignificant, or whatever it may be. So life experiences, past experiences, messages that we've received. Albert Ellis liked to use the metaphor of a tape recorder, and he would say, our mind is like a tape recorder. Everything that people have told us, we've recorded. And what happens is, maybe when we get into situations as adults, we just push the replay button and we hear that voice in our head, maybe quietly saying, hey, you can't do this. Hey, you're gonna, whatever it may be, right? So sometimes we've heard messages and we've received messages, or we've had experiences where we've sort of picked up some negative, unhealthy belief systems as a part of that. We also live in a culture and a society. So this is another one. So our unique personality, past experiences, messages we've received from other people. Then another one would be the society and culture that we live in. If we're not careful, we will pick up belief systems that our society promotes. And those ideas, this is not a sociology class, by the way, you know that, but not everything that our society promotes is healthy. So for example, we live in a very materialistic, I believe, society. We live in a society that promotes material things and promotes beauty and possessions as bringing people happiness. And I can just speak to you as someone who has worked in counseling, as a counselor for many years. I've worked with lots of people with lots of money, and they are miserable. And most of the time they're miserable because they thought their money would bring them joy. And all it brought them was stuff. And they are miserable. And part of what that's an example of is a person who buys into a belief system of our culture. There are ideas out there around men, around women, around relationships, around success or achievement or physical appearance that are really not very healthy, but we oftentimes believe them because we live in a world that promotes them. So we all have to be careful that we don't let the world rub off on us in ways that's not good for us. And then lastly, last idea around where does our unhealthy thinking come from? I use the term chemical imbalances. Some of you are familiar with that term. You know that, for example, some mental health conditions like some of the anxiety disorders or bipolar disorder or major depression, I'll even include addiction into this conversation. Sometimes when people battle depression, for example, as a part of their depression not just affects their emotions, it affects how they think and look at the world. Addiction is the same way. People who battle addiction have a way of looking at the world. The addiction and their substance use begins to affect not their brain. It affects their brain, but not just their brain, but their mind, how they look at the world and themselves. And a lot of times those types of problems can create negative patterns of thinking and relating. Those of you in the room who want to be drug and alcohol counselors, whether you use CBT or some other approach, you're going to spend a lot of time, if you do much drug and alcohol addiction counseling, you're going to spend a lot of time with your clients challenging them on their unhealthy, negative belief systems that they hold that are a part of their addiction. And part of maintaining sobriety and choosing recovery is changing my mind. It's not just stopping using. It's not just being abstinent and sober. That's part of recovery. You learn that in your other classes. The other part of recovery is healing myself spiritually, healing myself mentally, letting go of all of that junk that I used to or currently believe about myself and the world that's just not good for me. That's a part of what we do with people in addictions counseling, is helping them to change their mind. So anyway, all those are examples of different places or where our unhealthy thinking kind of comes from. And then I also too want to do this. I want to give you this acronym, this ANTS acronym, ANTS, which stands for Automatic Negative Thoughts or Statements. We talked about the word automatic last lecture. And so we're familiar with that term already. I've provided for you in the module a handout. I want you to go find that handout where I give you 7 or 8 examples of what we call ants. And what the ants are really is just a very, very simple way to give you a really quick, simple example of how unhealthy negative self-talk often can sound. Now, we could have a long conversation about that because it can and does sound a bunch of different ways. How it sounds in my life might be different for you, but I gave you some examples with the ants. Ants are just a really good way to kind of get a handle on, some common ways that negative self-talk can kind of sound in people's lives generally, right? So for example, there's something called personalization and overgeneralization, and all or nothing or black and white thinking. Something called mind reading and fortune telling and name calling and catastrophizing. All those terms I want you to be familiar with. Get that handout, and I want you to look at those different examples. Those are just examples of ways in which negative self-talk often can and does sound. All of those ants are more internal kind of patterns. And understanding that is part of what helps us to help other people, because we can help educate other people when they say, well, I don't think, my belief systems are just fine or whatever, right? Part of how we can help educate people is to help them is by understanding, well, what are some ways that negative self-talk often sounds like? What does it kind of look like, right? My hunch is on that ants handout, you will see yourself or others that probably on there. That's probably true probably for all of us, right? And so I just give you some examples of some automatic negative thoughts and statements that are just very, very common. So all of that is connected to this third core idea that we have this unhealthy tendency, and it is negative self-talk. So there's one more idea I want to talk to you about. This is the good news. So the good news is the last core idea. You can't really understand CBT, number one, unless you understand what is cognition and the importance of our thinking. Number two, the A, the B, the C, kind of how we're wired. Number three, our unhealthy tendency for negative, unhealthy self-talk and thinking and beliefs. Last idea is this: we can change how we talk to ourselves. I mean, it's real simple. It's complicated, but it's simple. Last idea is this: what we would call changing our mind, changing how we think and talk to ourselves. Ellis, when Albert Ellis was a young man and when he was developing this theory, it was back in the day when Freudian psychology was kind of predominant, still back in that day. And one of the ideas from Freud, sort of, was that by the time you and I become adults, we are who we are. So if you've got a bunch of problems, oh well, that's just how you are. You are how you are. You just got to live with it, right? Ellis and many others came along and said, hang on a second, that gives the impression that people can't grow and change and learn, and they can. And so Ellis, from his own experiences, realized that he could identify and change his unhealthy self-talk. It took time, it took practice, it took effort, but it was something he could do. And so this last idea is that we can change how we talk to ourselves. So this is where the D comes in. A, B, C, D. A, activating event. B, beliefs. C, emotional and behavioral consequences. The D stands for dispute, and that is focused on this idea of changing how we talk to ourselves. Dispute just means disputing our unhealthy negative self-talk, challenging it, identifying it, looking at where it comes from, identifying why it's not healthy, finding something else to begin to try to replace that with and change, right? So D stands for dispute. Activating event, beliefs, consequences, and then here's D, and it's dispute. And which means we work on our unhealthy self-talk. Now, here's the thing, I just mentioned this a couple of minutes ago. Changing a habit is not always easy. And again, many people, when you use CBT approaches, you realize people have been thinking in their mind, personalizing or whatever word you want to use. They've been thinking that way for a long time. And it's not always just like snap of the fingers, they just start talking, they start believing positively. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes energy, it takes motivation, but it's possible. And that's kind of the idea. So Ellis came up with this idea, this term called cognitive restructuring. Cognitive restructuring is a very broad term that is what it says it is. Cognitive restructuring means we restructure or work on our thinking, cognitive, right? So cognitive restructuring is really how we as helpers use CBT to help other people. And it can look and sound a bunch of different ways. There's all kinds of different interventions. If we had a whole semester to talk about CBT, I'd review with you 4 or 5 really good, effective, some of them really simple, some of them really fun, cognitive restructuring interventions, because there's a bunch of them that are out there through the years people have developed. But the bottom line for this class, I want you, number one, to be familiar with the term cognitive restructuring and it's 3 P's. It's 3 pieces or parts. And I know I've given you a bunch of acronyms in this class. Here's one more. This is the last one. 3 C's. C, C, C. Catch, check, change are the 3 C's of cognitive restructuring. Like I said, cognitive restructuring is a broad term that just refers to when we as helpers try to help people to identify and change their negative self-talk, or we and ourselves. And it basically involves 3 steps. Number 1 is the catch. And so I have to catch myself. And kind of the idea with catch is I can't work on something that I don't know is there. So I can't change my negative self-talk unless I know what it sounds like. So I have to learn how to start listening for it. I have to learn how to identify it. There's all kinds of little homework assignments that we oftentimes can give clients to help them start journaling or writing down and kind of for them personalizing, what does this sound like for me? Some people are real concrete black and white thinkers. Other people tend to personalize lots of things. Lots of people make assumption, we call assumption errors. They assume things without any evidence. You got to kind of get a handle on what all that is before you can start working on it. So that's catch. Catch basically is catching myself when I find myself engaged in that negative self-talk. Not always easy because again, how we talk to ourselves is often automatic, really quick, and it's often kind of silent or quiet. But that's the first part, catch. So I catch myself. That takes time, takes effort, takes practice. That's not like a one-time thing. It just takes time. Once I start doing that, then comes check. Catch myself, then I have to check myself. And what that means is that I begin to think about several things. Where does this come from? This tendency that I have to believe that everything I try, I mess up. Where did that come from? Has someone told me that? Have I learned that through experience? What's that all about? Kind of a good question. So what's that all about? How does that belief system affect my life? What are some ways, kind of just checking and kind of almost like inventory, kind of taking some inventory and thinking about where does this come from? How does it affect me? What are some ways in which it just creates problems for me? You know, kind of just like an inventory. We use the word check. Catch myself, check myself. That takes time. That's a process, right? And once I kind of start doing that, then comes the change myself. And the change is where over time I identify something else to believe. That sounds kind of weird. I identify if I'm always telling myself, hey, I mess everything up. Well, part of dispute is looking at the reality or the accuracy of those situations and realizing that in actuality, a lot of times when we say things like that to ourselves, I mess everything up, what we realize quickly is that actually we don't mess everything up. We get a lot of stuff right. Most of us do. We mess a few things up because we're human. And once we start kind of realizing the reality of what's real, right, we can begin to change and catch ourselves when we are talking to ourselves a certain way and stopping ourselves and changing the old to the new, the unhealthy to the healthy. And again, there's all kinds of exercises that we can use with that as well too, as far as helping people with that. But for the sake of the scope of this class, I just want you just to be familiar with those 3 basic C's. And I posted for you a little cognitive restructuring mini case study in the module. Look at that and get kind of an idea, sort of see how that kind of flows as far as where I gave you an example of a real life situation that I wrote about, where I just changed the name to protect the confidentiality of the person who was telling me the story, where they were able to use cognitive restructuring to start to realize what their negative self-talk sounded like, to kind of evaluate it, to check it, and then to eventually over time change it. Catch, check, change, okay, is the idea with cognitive restructuring. Real quickly, last thing before I say goodbye, key idea here is this. Let's go back to the ABC for a little bit. The good news is if I can in my life, I'll use myself as an example, if I can in my life begin to, let's say for example, that I was kind of someone who struggled with kind of insecurity and always thinking in my mind that no one loves me, that I mess everything up, so why try? If I begin to change that for the better, the more healthy, the idea is if I change my thinking for the better, I'm going to feel better and I'm going to make better choices. That's a key idea. That comes from AB. That's BC. Remember the ABC? This is BC. If I am always telling myself that there's no use trying, I can't figure it out, there's no use trying, that's my belief system, well, that's going to affect my emotions and my choices in a negative, unhealthy way. If I begin to change that over time and begin to replace that belief with, no, I can figure this out, just try. It's okay, I can figure it out, or whatever. What's going to happen is that change in thinking is going to naturally, it might not happen right away, but it's going to happen eventually because it's just the way we're wired. A change in thinking is going to change our emotions, which is then going to lead to probably a change in behavior, different choices. It's going to be easier for us to make different choices. So the good news with cognitive restructuring is if I learn to begin to replace my old unhealthy negative self-talk with something more healthy, if I begin to kind of modify and change over time and do some restructuring of how I look at the world, well, I'm going to begin to feel different. And by different, I mean better, more healthy, more constructive. I'll feel less isolated. I'll feel less insecure. I'll feel more confident maybe. And when our emotions begin to change, then our choices begin to change off into our behavior begins to change. So that's BC, kind of going back a little bit, right? So that's the good news of cognitive restructuring, is if we're able to change our thinking for the healthy, for the better, that naturally is then going to produce a change in our emotions and then in our choices and our behavior. So 4 core ideas. This video, of course, just the 3rd and the 4th. I really have enjoyed it. It's been my pleasure, my honor to be leading you in this theories class. Y'all have been awesome. I appreciate again your flexibility this semester. I hope you come back. I hope every single one of you, if you need to, comes back, take some more classes with us in human services. Take some with me if you're able to. Hope that you have a great summer. If I don't see you in between now and the fall, have a good one.